Actually, until yesterday, my topic was going to be the power of narrative, because that's the focus of my next book. But as I was stepping back and reflecting on it, I said, wait a minute, this is a finance conference. They're not going to want to hear about narratives. They're going to hear about numbers. So I switched my topic at the last minute, and I'm going to start with a number that I think is a really important number and yet not very well known or understood. And it's based on some of the research that we've been doing at the Center for the Edge. And it was based on a really fundamental question, which was, given all this incredible exponential digital technology, how are companies doing with all this amazing technology that's available to us? To our surprise, we couldn't even find anyone who had asked the question, much less answered it. So we took it on ourselves to try to develop an answer. And we ended up looking at all US public companies, all companies listed on a public exchange. We went back to 1965, a few years before digital technology really came into the business landscape, until today. And we took as our measure of performance, and we can debate, it's not perfect, but we think it's good enough for the exercise. We took as our measure of performance return on assets. So, from 1965 until today, for all public companies in the United States, what's happened to return on assets? It's basically collapsed. Over that time period, it's declined by 75%. It's been a long, sustained erosion. There are some waves along the way that correspond to the short-term economic cycles, but the long-term trend is very clear. And even more importantly, there is absolutely no sign of it leveling off, and certainly no sign of it turning around. So if we want a measure of mounting performance pressure, and that's what I call the dark side of all this exponential technology, is mounting pressure, that's a pretty good indicator that we are experiencing increasing pressure in the face of all this technology. And we're becoming less and less effective in responding to that pressure. And by the way, one of the reasons we didn't look at things like return on equity or return to shareholders, we did look at it, but we didn't take it as our primary metric, is because companies have become pretty adept at cushioning the blow to the shareholders. Increased dividend payouts, increased debt on the balance sheet, stock buybacks. There are all kinds of measures that can be used to cushion the blow to the shareholders. But return on assets, we believe, measures the fundamental performance of the business before you get to the financial engineering questions. So what's going on? I mean, part of the answer is there is increasing pressure in the form of increased competitive intensity, increased pressure in the acceleration of the pace of change, shortening of product life cycles, increased pressure in the form of these extreme events, the Taleb's black swans that come in out of nowhere and disrupt our best laid plans and predictions. All of that's coming together to increase pressure. And it's not that we're not trying harder to respond to it. During that same time period, 65 to today, labor productivity more than doubled. Hurrah! We squeezed a lot more out of our workers. ROA collapsed. So, at the end of the day, our belief is the answer is the reason for this erosion, long-term erosion in ROA, is because of the increasing disconnect between the exponential world that we're increasingly experiencing and the linear mindsets, practices, and institutions that we are pursuing in terms of responding to that exponential world. And that disconnect is not producing results. So I think the questions on the table are, okay, that's interesting, now what do we do about it? Given limited time, I'm going to fly at a very high level, and I'm going to focus on three things that we think are imperatives in terms of responding to this mounting pressure and turning pressure into opportunity. The first one is redefining strategy. Second is to reframe, rethink how we do innovation. And then finally, refocus transformation. So that's a pretty hefty agenda. I'll quickly go through each of these. And by the way, all of this, I'm going to, again, give you a very limited view, but we've done a lot of research on all three of these areas, and we publish our research. It's freely available. So if you're interested, just look online, and you should be able to find the research reports. So let me start with redefining strategy. There's an interesting approach to strategy, and as was mentioned, I've spent most of my career in Silicon Valley, and I've watched the really successful high-tech companies and how they pursue strategy. And they actually have a very different approach to strategy than most conventional companies do. It goes by many different names. I call it the zoom out, zoom in approach. And what it does is it focuses on two time frames in parallel. One time horizon is 10 to 20 years. And on that horizon, the two questions are, 10 to 20 years from now, what is our relevant market or industry going to look like? And then second question is, given that, what kind of company will we need to be 10 to 20 years from now in order to continue to create value and succeed in that market? That's the zoom out piece. The zoom in piece, very different time horizon, 6 to 12 months. On that time horizon, the questions are, what are the 2 or 3 business initiatives, no more, 2 or 3 business initiatives that would have the greatest impact in accelerating our movement from where we are today to where we need to be 10 to 20 years from now? Secondly, do we have a critical mass of resources against those 2 or 3 business initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months? And third, what are the metrics for success? At the end of 6 to 12 months, how would we know whether we've succeeded or not? How could we measure our progress? So clear view of metrics. Now that's the zoom in piece. That's really interesting when you compare it to the way most traditional companies do strategy. I think we're all familiar with the classic approach, which is the 5-year plan. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. That's our strategy. In the zoom out, zoom in approach, 1 to 5 years is virtually irrelevant. They spend almost no time on that time frame. It's all about 10 to 20 years or 6 to 12 months. If we get that right, everything else will take care of itself. Very different mindset and approach. And I think it addresses some of the challenges that I see in large companies when they do strategy. I mean, I'm sure many of you, particularly those in large companies, have been through some kind of scenario development exercise, scenario planning exercise. You go to an offsite with the leadership team, you imagine what the future could look like, you come up with alternative futures, you might even pick a most likely or probable future. And then the meeting's over, it's adjourned, and you go back to work. And you get sucked into the day-to-day activities, and nothing changes. It was an interesting conceptual, theoretical exercise, but nothing changes. In the zoom out, zoom in approach, that meeting is not over until you have identified the 2 or 3 business initiatives in the next 6 to 12 months that will get a critical mass of resources to drive you to that future. Suddenly it takes something that's a very theoretical, conceptual exercise and makes it very pragmatic and short-term in terms of impact. So I think a very powerful discipline from that viewpoint. The other area where I think it has some potential is when I talk to large companies, I'm often confronted with the stress of we've got so much going on. You know, we've fallen into basically a reactive approach to the marketplace. We just sense and respond quickly to whatever's happening. And we launch an initiative when something happens over there, another initiative over there. And we've got too many initiatives, and nothing has critical mass. The zoom out, zoom in approach says no, resist that. Find a way to align around the 2 or 3 short-term initiatives that are really going to have the greatest impact in driving you to the future where you need to be. That's a very powerful framing and focusing device to say, We need to make sure we have a critical mass of resources. Not to say you're not going to do other things if there are resources yet still available, but that we've aligned and agreed upon the critical mass resources that we're going to pursue in the next 6 to 12 months. So it's a very different kind of approach to strategy, and certainly one that I highly recommend as a way to really effectively deal with this exponential world we're living in. Because I think one of the biggest risks and challenges, and one of the reasons ROA is falling so rapidly, is because we are falling into a reactive approach to the world. It's so complex, so many things going on, so uncertain, all we can do is just react. That's not going to do it. Focus is critical. So that's one element in terms of responding to this mounting pressure, redefining strategy, rethinking strategy. There's a second element which has to do with reframing innovation. Now, I've been in a lot of leadership meetings of companies around the world, and I can almost guarantee that no matter what company I'm with, what the broader country is, somewhere on the agenda is innovation. Virtually every leadership meeting now has an innovation item on the agenda. Let's talk about innovation. And when we get to that topic in the meeting, the conversation very quickly narrows down to product innovation or technology innovation. The question is, how can we come up with a more creative product or service, get it into market quickly, and reap the rewards of that innovation? In some more sophisticated companies, we might even get into process innovation or business model innovation. I want to suggest there's a level of innovation that is not yet on the agenda, but needs to be if we're going to respond to this exponential world. And it goes back to the most basic question of all, which is, why do we have large institutions? You know, in the history of mankind, large institutions are a relatively recent development. There's no reason to believe they're inherent in our existence. There was an economist back in 1937 who tried to answer that question of why we're seeing emergence of large institutions around the world. And he wrote an essay to try to answer the question. It was a pretty good essay. He actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for the essay. His name was Ronald Coase. And at the risk of oversimplifying a very subtle and sophisticated point of view, his basic answer to the question was, we have large institutions because of scalable efficiency. That it's far easier and lower cost to coordinate activity if it's across a large number of individuals, if they're all within one institution, than if they're spread out across many different institutions. Now, at the time he wrote that essay in 1937, I believe he was remarkably accurate and perceptive in describing what was driving the emergence of large institutions around the world. I think the question that we need to put on the table today is, in this exponential world that we're in not just entering, but proceeding through, is that rationale still as compelling as it was in 1937? And if not, is there a different rationale? And I will say I'm not of the camp. There's a large cadre within Silicon Valley who believe that large institutions are dinosaurs, they're going to go away, we're all going to become free agents. I don't believe that. I think there is still a very strong rationale for large institutions, but very different from scalable efficiency. The rationale that we believe is going to drive the emergence and success of large institutions in the future is what we call scalable learning. That the reason we will come together in large institutions is because we will learn faster together as part of a large institution than we ever could on our own or as part of some smaller organization. And in an exponential world that's changing at such a dramatic pace, that ability to learn faster is hugely valuable. Now, the challenge is, when I talk to executives about scalable efficiency and scalable learning, I often get the response, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Scalable efficiency and scalable learning. We'll do both. Yes. My response is, wait a minute. At least based on the work we've done, those two rationales are in fundamental conflict with each other. You either choose scalable efficiency or you choose scalable learning. You're not going to be able to do both. And just to amplify on that a bit, I mean, think about the key message that we deliver in the scalable efficiency environments that we've created. What's one of the key messages? Failure is not an option. You deliver as predicted, as expected, efficiently and reliably. Okay, got that message. What does learning require? Learning requires failure. If you're not failing, you're not learning. Okay, now let's think about the environments we've created for scalable efficiency. We've tightly specified all the activities that need to be done throughout the company. We've highly standardized those activities so they're done in exactly the same way, regardless of where you are in the company. And we've tightly integrated all those activities, removed all those inefficient buffers separating activities for efficiency. So think about that environment, tightly specified, highly standardized, tightly integrated. Where's the room to experiment, to improvise, to innovate? There's no room. It's why when I talk to executives about scalable learning, their answer is, oh yeah, we do learning. We have a training room. We take people out of the work environment. We send them out to the training room. They can learn all they want, and then they come back into the work environment and do their job as assigned. To be provocative, our view is that actually training rooms are going to become more and more irrelevant to learning. That the most powerful and effective learning is going to occur day to day on the job in the work environment, not in some training room. And it's going to be learning in the form of creating new knowledge. When you confront something you've never confronted before, where you can't go listen to a lecture to tell you how to respond to that, you have to do it on the spot. That kind of learning is extremely powerful, and it needs to be done in the work environment, day to day, on the job. A really interesting question is, if that's what it takes, let's take all this design thinking and design methodologies that we've so creatively applied to our products and services and redesigning the customer experience. How about if we took that design thinking and applied it to ourselves? And said, if our primary goal is to accelerate learning and performance improvement in the work environment, what would that work environment look like? Physical environment, virtual environment, management systems, the entire worker experience, how would we redesign it to accelerate learning and performance improvement? We did a major research project on that question. We actually couldn't find a single company that has even taken that on as an opportunity, much less implemented it. We did find interesting slices where companies have taken portions of the work environment and rethought them and come up with some promising results, which give us encouragement that there's actually a huge white space here, huge opportunity to be addressed, to innovate in. And I'll just give you one example of a company that we found interesting in this regard. It's a company called LiveOps. LiveOps does customer call center operations on an outsourced basis for other larger companies. One of the interesting things about LiveOps is actually they have no call centers. They operate through a workforce of 20,000 people, all of whom work from their homes. There is no call center that they come to. The calls are routed to the homes based on the individual and the particular nature of the call. But in the context of scalable learning, what was interesting to us was LiveOps took inspiration from an online video game. It's called World of Warcraft. Some of you may be familiar with it. But one of the elements in World of Warcraft is every player in the game is given a real-time performance dashboard that in real time feeds back how they're doing in the game on multiple dimensions of performance. Radical notion. LiveOps came up with the idea, why don't we give all our employees a real-time performance dashboard to tell them how they're doing, give them feedback in terms of how they're doing, minute by minute. Now, I would wager that if most large traditional companies took that approach, a real-time performance dashboard for their employees, they would use it as an instrument of punishment, right? You're falling behind on these 3 metrics. You've got 6 months to get your act together or you're going to be fired. LiveOps did something very different. LiveOps encouraged all their workers to ask for help. And they created an online discussion forum where the workers could go and post the problem. You know, I'm having trouble handling this kind of customer call on this dimension of performance. Does anybody have any ideas or suggestions on what I can do to improve my performance? And most importantly, LiveOps started to watch, recognize, and reward the workers who are emerging as coaches and helpers of the other workers. So in effect, what they were creating was a very powerful peer-to-peer learning environment to encourage their workers to learn faster and improve their performance more rapidly. Very different model and approach to the way most traditional companies operate. And so again, I think the opportunity and the imperative is for us to step back. When we talk about innovation, I don't want to say ignore products and service innovation or business model innovation or process innovation, but until and unless you've asked the most basic form of innovation, which is how do we innovate on the rationale for why we exist to begin with, and embraced scalable learning, and maybe that's not the rationale, but at least in our research, we believe that is, and systematically thought through all the things that are going to have to change if you're really serious about scalable learning, because in our experience at least, it changes everything. Nothing is left untouched. Until you've addressed that level of innovation, the mounting pressure will continue. So that leads to my third topic, which is transformation. And I will say here that I'm struck by the number of companies that I deal with today who say, oh, we have a digital transformation program. We're doing digital transformation. Interesting. When I start to ask questions about what they're doing, with few exceptions, the answer I get back is what they're doing is applying digital exponential technology to do what they've always done, faster, cheaper, and more conveniently. Scalable efficiency. Very few, if any, have stepped back to ask the most fundamental question of all in transformation, which is, what business are we really in? What business should we be in? And what do we need to do to transform ourselves to become that kind of business? And by the way, this is where that zoom out, zoom in approach to strategy becomes extremely helpful. Because at least in my experience, if you zoom out 10 to 20 years from now, and your answer is we're pretty much the same company we are today, except faster, cheaper, more conveniently, I would suggest you go back for another day to zoom out again. Because our belief is in an exponential world, the fundamental nature of the businesses we're in are going to transform at a basic level. So, in the topic of transformation, I've been involved in large-scale transformation efforts for about over 30 years. And I only really have one lesson to share with you from all that experience. That lesson is, if you believe transformation is a rational process, If you believe it's about getting the right data, doing the right analytics, putting it into the right charts, presenting it to the right people, my experience is you've already lost. At least for me, transformation is not a rational process at all. It is fundamentally a political process. And it really only has three objectives: easy to state, hard to implement. First objective: identify and neutralize, by all means possible, the enemies of change. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds, because at least in my experience, maybe you've got some other examples, but in my experience, I have never been in a leadership meeting, a senior leadership meeting of a company, where an executive has stood up and announced, "I am an enemy of change." Maybe you have. In my experience, they sit around the table, they smile, they nod, "Yes, we need to change." And then they retreat to the privacy of their offices and conspire to figure out how they're going to undermine this process of change. So identifying the enemies of change is non-trivial, but absolutely necessary. You need to know who they are. Second objective: identify and strengthen, by all means possible, the champions of change. And then there's a third objective, which goes against a very human instinct that I think we all have. But here I take great inspiration from a book that I hope many of you have read. I certainly recommend it if you haven't. It's called The Art of War. And one of the key messages in The Art of War is if you have to engage the enemy in battle, you've already lost the war. What's our instinct? If we get conviction that we got to change, we want to confront the enemies as quickly as possible, do battle, get it over with, move on. Resist that temptation. Avoid confrontation between the enemies of change and the champions of change until the enemies have become so weak and the champions so strong that a battle is not even necessary. It's a foregone conclusion as to who's going to win. So, three key objectives in terms of driving change. And unfortunately, I think that the way, and I'll just say that a lot of this perspective is driven by a great respect that I have developed over these decades for the immune system and the antibodies that exist within every large company. I guarantee no matter what large company we're talking about, there is a very strong immune system and set of antibodies that are going to fight change as strongly as possible. And in that context, I've become very skeptical of the conventional approach to transformation, which is what I describe as a top-down, big bang approach to transformation. This is where a senior executive gets conviction, we need to change, we got to change everything, gets up in front of their leadership team, announces the change we need to do, and because we're a large company, this is going to take a lot of money. You can't do it on a shoestring. A lot of money. And because we're a large company, this is going to take a long time. You can't do this overnight. Can't turn around a battleship overnight. But trust me, at the end of everything, wonderful things will happen. Well, again, in my experience, what that executive has just done is put a big bullseye on their back and invited the immune system and the antibodies to come out and mobilize. A lot of money? Where's that money coming from? Not out of my pocket. A long time? We got quarterly performance targets. We can't afford to be distracted by long-term things. And it's the reason why most academic studies show, all academic studies I'm familiar with, show that large-scale transformation efforts have an extremely high failure rate. Anywhere between 70 to 80% of the transformation efforts fail to achieve a single objective of the transformation program. So, the question is there an alternative? I am an optimist. I believe that all institutions are capable of transformation. And I actually believe that a lot of the forces that we've been talking about, the technologies and forces unleashed by those technologies, are creating the possibility of an alternative approach to transformation that has a lot of promise to it. And it's what we call scaling edges. And in this approach, rather than going in and trying to transform the core of the business, instead, our advice is identify a promising edge of the existing business that today is relatively modest in terms of revenue, maybe even no profitability. But if you understand the exponential forces that are playing out in the markets and industries around you, that edge has the potential to scale to the point where it could actually become the new core of your company, not just a diversification, not just a growth initiative, but actually the new core of your company. And focus your efforts on scaling that edge as rapidly as possible. And I think that's certainly got some challenges to it, but again, I go back to the zoom out, zoom in approach to strategy. These ultimately, in our view, are all interlinked. But if you do the zoom out, zoom in approach to strategy, that zoom out perspective will help you, will be a great filter to look at promising edges that might exist today that have the potential to scale to that point where they could become the new core of the business. So the zoom out provides a great framework. In picking the edges, we have a whole set of filters that we use. One of them is if it's an edge that requires massive investment and a long time frame before you can really get into market with anything tangible, our advice is put that edge to the side, find another edge. The edges we look for are edges where there is an opportunity to move very quickly to get at least some impact in the marketplace with modest investment. So you can start to quickly point to tangible impact. Another filter we use is if it's an edge that requires that the initial growth of the edge involves cannibalizing your core, stay away from that edge. Find an edge which, at least in the early stages, is going to be additive. We'll identify new revenue and profit opportunities that aren't going to take from the core, because if you're taking from the core, guaranteed the core will come after you. So scaling these edges, and again, we're big proponents of design thinking, design methodologies. We've come up with 12 design principles for scaling edges. One of the design, I'll just go into one of them because again, it's a bit counterintuitive. The design principle is starve the edge. And again, every instinct, if you've just told me that this edge actually has the potential to become the new core of my company, it's the future of my business, I want to put as much money as I can into that edge. That's our future. We can't let it fail. Resist. For 3 reasons. One is, the more money you put into that edge in the early stages, that money's coming from somewhere, and again, the immune system will come after you to get it back. So you want to limit the amount you have to put in the edge in the early stages. Second reason is because if you put a lot of money in the edge in the outset, it creates an atmosphere of complacency among the edge leadership team. Hey, things are really good. We got a lot of money. Let's go out and have a beer. No, you want a sense of urgency. My God, how the hell are we going to do anything with so little resource? And the third reason, and probably most important reason, is if you starve the edge, it forces the edge leadership team from day one to be very aggressive in reaching out and connecting with and leveraging third parties to create a broader ecosystem and network and platforms to leverage their own meager resources. And our belief is that's one of the key principles of an exponential business, is connecting through networks and platforms to leverage your own resources. So for a variety of reasons, our advice is starve the edge. I'll give you just a quick example of, there aren't a lot of great examples. I'll certainly acknowledge that in terms of successful scaling edges. Again, in part, it's because our belief is the forces that are making this feasible are really now coming available and haven't been around for a long time. But actually, there's one example of a company that I think scaled an edge and transformed itself, and it's actually in the financial services industry. There may even be some of you in the audience. State Street Bank. Pretty old institution by US standards, founded in 1792. Pretty old company. For most of its life, it was basically a very conventional retail bank. Branch banks took deposits, gave out loans. Mid-1970s started to experience increasing pressure, competitive pressure. And one of their executives one day came up with an interesting idea. He said, in our back office, we have world-class transaction processing capability. Why don't we rent out some of that capability to other commercial banks that are experiencing this kind of competitive pressure? Long story short, it tapped into a huge unmet need. They scaled that edge to the point where it basically is the new core of the business. Fundamental transformation of a very large traditional institution driven by scaling an edge. So I think there are some examples, there are other examples we could cite that's in our research reports, but I think the point is that we need to think about other ways of transforming. First of all, we need to be clear, transformation is an imperative, it's not a choice, and it's not just about doing things more efficiently, lower cost. It's about rethinking at a fundamental level, what business are we in and how does everything need to change in order to accommodate that? And then pursuing a scaling edge approach as a way to avoid the immune system and the antibodies. So I've done a very rapid run through of 3 different imperatives. One is around rethinking strategy, one is about reframing innovation, and then refocusing transformation. I just want to pull back at the last moment to just say that I started my career many, many years ago at a consulting firm called BCG, Boston Consulting Group. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was a long time ago. In the early days, a bit of a simplification, BCG made its reputation around one chart. And it was, they looked at how performance improved in the semiconductor industry over time. Not the performance of the chip, but performance of companies. And they came up with an interesting, very predictable pattern of evolution. They called it the experience curve. And then over a number of years, they ended up looking at a whole range of other markets and industries, everything from Japanese beer to toilet paper. Turns out virtually every industry has that experience curve to how it improves performance over time. Very accurate, very perceptive. The big problem with it, it is a diminishing returns curve. The more experience you get in a market or industry, the longer and harder you have to work to get to that next increment of performance improvement. Our belief is if we understand the potential of all this exponential technology that we've been talking about, that for the first time, we have an opportunity to shift from a diminishing returns curve to an increasing returns curve, where the more who participate, the faster everybody's going to learn, the more rapidly performance will improve. That's a huge opportunity. That's the opportunity that we believe exponential technology creates. And the opportunity for us is to move from, again, I started my talk with this analysis of return on assets as an indicator of mounting pressure. It's a paradox. These exponential technologies at one level are creating increasing pressure, but at another level, they're creating expanding opportunity. And it's up to us to make that transition from pressure to opportunity. I think it's a huge opportunity. And I would say that if you think about the approaches that I talked about in terms of strategy, innovation, transformation, one key theme through all of that, and it's a key theme in my last book called The Power of Pull, is small moves, smartly made, can set big things in motion. We don't need to pour a ton of money into this. We need to make some very smart moves, smartly focused, and let the exponential forces drive the impact in ways that we would have never imagined. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.